Okay, in our last video we were talking about how African Americans made some significant gains in terms of their quality of life and general opportunities, but that those were limited in some ways. And what we're going to see is that there's kind of this moment where African Americans have a lot of hope and that there'll be a lot of change in the future, but that very quickly white Southern governments are going to begin gaining the upper hand over them. We're going to be talking about this more today with this lecture called Reconstruction Comes to an End. It goes with a graphic organizer that looks like this. I'm going to see how slowly white supremacy reasserts itself for a variety of reasons in the American South. Okay? So, let's look here at the PowerPoint. So, Reconstruction is going to come to an end. I need to actually back this out a little bit. First of all, white Southerners are slowly going to begin reclaiming their lands, regaining their wealth, reestablishing their control over their work populations through sharecropping, and so they're able to better mount a resistance against the protections that had been granted during Congressional Reconstruction. First of all, they start calling Northerners who come down into the South, they start calling them carpetbaggers, and this was kind of a term, kind of a negative term that was used to describe Northerners that had come down into the South. The reality is that Northerners come down into the South during the post-war period for a variety of reasons. Some of them wanted to be teachers. Some of them wanted to be workers for the Freedmen's Bureau. They came with noble intentions. But in a post-war period where you have a lot of people who are kind of desperate to find family members and there's a lot of people walking around that don't know each other or have long-standing bonds with each other, it's really easy to scam people. And so a lot of people from the North came down into the South and ran scams on freed slaves and poor whites. And so they kind of got a bad name. And so while there are lots of different reasons why Northerners came down into the South, the name carpetbagger has kind of a pejorative or a negative tone to it, and that's because white Southerners started, basically trying to stereotype Northerners as a negative element and having negative influences on the South. Also, there were some white Southerners who had decided to become Republicans for self-serving reasons. If you want to get a government contract to produce things or hold government office, the only way to do that was to actually be a Republican because they were the ones who held power. So they called them scalawags. This is the name for Southerners who joined the Republican Party. And Southerners basically considered them to be like traitors to the Southern cause. And then we also get the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, during this time period. The Ku Klux Klan stands for Circle of Friends. It started out as kind of a social club in Tennessee. Some say it was founded by Bedford Forrest, but eventually came to increasingly terrorize and intimidate African Americans in the South and try and keep them from exercising their rights and privileges. Politically, we also see a lot of gains made by white Southerners at the price of blacks. One is things called black codes. You might remember slave codes after Nat Turner's Rebellion, which sharply limited the kind of activities that slaves could engage in. Black codes kind of did the same thing. They were racist state laws that limited freed slaves' rights. And let me go on a little bit about this to make it make sense. It's such a general term that it might be difficult for you to understand exactly what black codes were. Black codes differed from state to state because they were state laws, but let me just give you an example of some of them from, say, Mississippi. In Mississippi, the black code said things like, white people cannot marry black people, and if they do, they'll be punished with a felony charge and life imprisonment. Black people can't have alcohol, they can't carry weapons, they can't gather for no reason. If they're together, they can't loiter, for example. If they're together, they have to have a purpose or they have to be working or something, but black people can't just hang around together. They can't be cruel to animals, they can't make seditious speech. All kinds of limits on their rights to free speech or assembly or the right to carry arms or weapons that did not apply to white people. So really just second-class citizenship. One of the strangest things it said is that if a black person was accused of breaking the black codes and they couldn't pay their fine and they had to go to jail, that they would pull the black prisoners out onto the courtyard steps once a month and they would auction them off to white people. The white person would agree to pay their fine, and whoever would be willing to pay the black person's fine, then that black person had to go work for that white person until they had worked off that amount of money. So you can see this starts to sound suspiciously like slavery. Also, if you were a black person working for a white person and you ran away, they could send someone to catch you. And they didn't have to pay you until the end of your term. So black workers working for white people could be exposed to very harsh working conditions and punishments, and they really couldn't do anything about it because they wouldn't be paid until their last day of work. So those are the kinds of examples of black codes that really just kept black people in a position much like that of their former enslaved position. Alright, so politically, those were black codes. There were also poll taxes. Poll taxes made you pay a fine to vote. Not a fine, I'm sorry. A poll tax was initially a fine. It was like you had to pay. The problem with poll taxes is that it also affected poor, uneducated whites. So they finally had to come up with some other ways to try and keep people from voting. Another flawed attempt they did was called the literacy test, where you had to prove you could read in order to vote, but that also negatively affected poor whites who might have limited literacy skills. So the ultimate answer is something called the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause says that if your grandfather could vote in 1860, you don't have to pay the poll tax or take the literacy test. So that's really the way in which they perfected the way in which these laws would only affect black people, and therefore only black people would be forced to pay these onerous taxes or be forced to take increasingly ridiculous tests to get the right to vote. They passed the Amnesty Act during this time period also. It basically said that former Confederates could now vote and hold office again. That should be hold, not old. Hold office. And so increasingly we're going to see a lot more former Confederates come back into politics and positions of power in the South. And there is going to be an attempt on the part of Ulysses S. Grant to try and stop this kind of rise of white supremacy. For a while, he enforced something called the Enforcement Acts, which were an anti-KKK provision. It basically said that where there was proof that the KKK was trying to intimidate voters, that they could come in and run elections and take over that function for the states or local governments. Also, he sent out troops to try and fight the KKK, but in time we're going to see that the federal government becomes increasingly fatigued with their efforts to try and fight the KKK. Public opinion also starts to change about... Oh, should I back up? Oh, I just want to show you this visual. This visual here is an example of black prisoners being brought out onto the courthouse steps to be auctioned off, according to what the black code said at the time. Okay, so public opinion starts to change. First of all, it's kind of like anything when you're going in and trying to rebuild and government contracts are being handed out. Inevitably, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of people start to feel that their money is being wasted in the South. Also, Grant's administration comes to be beset by some scandals. They're called the Whiskey Ring, where it was clear that some of his appointees were not actually, they were pocketing taxes on alcohol. And then the Belknap bribery, which is where they were taking bribes to sell stuff on Native American reservations. So those kind of things made the Grant administration look like it was too corrupt to actually manage the people's money and oversee Reconstruction. Also, the economy goes down. In 1873, there's a panic that makes people very conservative about the economy and their money, and they just get distracted from Reconstruction and their efforts to punish the South. Also, there's a currency dispute that kind of sweeps up the country, and the poor want more money printed, and that kind of distracts people also from Reconstruction efforts. And then the Supreme Court is very much dominated by Southerners during this time period, and they issue some very interesting court rulings, really creative court rulings, I would say, during this time period to undermine Reconstruction. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about both of those, but all of that is to say that slowly people's willingness to really stay in the game and keep dedicating a lot of time, energy, and money to the Reconstruction cause in the South really starts to fade away. Let me just talk about two examples of the Supreme Court cases from the time period. The first one is called U.S. versus Cruikshank, and what it says is that only the government can't discriminate against people, but everyone else can, is basically what this ruling says. So the government can't discriminate, but it said if private businesses want to discriminate, they can do that. If private clubs, I don't even mean private, I mean anyone can discriminate on the basis of color except the government. So if McDonald's wants to discriminate, if there was a McDonald's back then, of course there was not, but any public establishment that wants to discriminate can, is basically what this ruling says. So segregated facilities for whites and blacks and those kinds of things are going to be upheld by this ruling. And then U.S. versus Reese says that while race can't be used to keep people from voting, so what it says here is it undermined the idea that all black males can vote. It ruled that the 15th Amendment didn't give the right to vote. It simply said you can't be denied the right to vote because of your race. But that basically says that the grandfather clause is okay, because the grandfather clause doesn't say that black people can't vote. The grandfather clause says that if people whose grandfathers couldn't vote in 1860 can't vote, and that doesn't say a thing about the color of their skin. We all know that actually it does. It's really just aimed at black people. Only black people's grandfathers couldn't vote in 1860, but it doesn't say it explicitly in the law. It talks about your grandfather in 1860. It doesn't say anything about the color of the skin of your grandfather in the case of the grandfather clause. So you can see that the Supreme Court is interpreting these cases in such a way that it just pretty much undermines their intent. The spirit of the law is undermined by them. And basically they're going to open up the door for segregated facilities and all other kinds of ways of keeping black people from voting without, as long as you don't actually mention the color of their skin as the reason why they can't vote. Okay? Also, the Republican Party is going to become increasingly divided against themselves. White Southern scalawags are going to increasingly make up part of the Republican Party, and they really have no intention of kind of towing the party line on protecting and empowering African Americans. And the party splits over corruption, and you get a Republican wing versus a liberal Republicans. So it's kind of like just the party becomes split and not able to be united in a united front to oversee Reconstruction in the South. So we had an election in 1876, and there's a Republican running. His name is Rutherford B. Hayes. He's of Ohio. And a Democrat, Samuel Tilden of New York. And it's a very weird election. You can see here in this picture, I'm not sure if you can see so well, but there's a black family here at their hearth, and there's a KKK guy with a hood on him who has got a gun pointing in the door, trying to terrorize these African Americans and perhaps keep them from exercising their rights. It was that kind of actions on the part of the KKK terrorizing voters in Florida that made it unclear who won the vote in Florida. And so while Tilden wins the popular vote, without Florida's electoral votes, he is short one electoral vote. And Florida's 20 electoral votes are uncertain because of this KKK violence. But of the 20 votes that are unclear in Florida, Tilden only needs one of the 20. So the Electoral College can't really render a verdict without figuring out what to do with all 20 of these votes in Florida. So, unlike the election of 2000, say, when Gore and Bush tied, and that went to the Supreme Court to decide, in this election in 1876, Congress handles it. The Republicans decide to put together an electoral commission that will come to a decision about how to solve this presidential crisis. And ironically, this committee, this election committee, has one more Republican on it than it has a Republican majority. So they come up with a compromise, a very creative compromise that has been long questioned by historians over time, because it gives all 20 of those electoral votes, rather than splitting those electoral votes, of which Tilden only needed one, they gave all of them to Rutherford B. Hayes. So in the compromise of 1877, Hayes becomes president. He receives all 20 of the electoral votes. We think an under-the-table deal was made that the Democrats would go along with this decision as long as all the Union troops are going to leave the South. So the result is something we call redemption, or basically white Southerners regain control of the South, and they regain all the governmental positions, and Union troops leave the South, and hopefully you're seeing that this is going to be a very bad day for African Americans, because there'll no longer be anyone down there who is willing to protect and empower them. So white supremacy takes back over in the South. It's called home rule, that white Southerners will now be ruling their own homes as they had done before the Civil War and not since afterwards. And this graphic here helps you see how there's kind of an alliance between the KKK and former Confederates to now take back over the South. And it says here, the Union as it was. And this says worse than slavery. And you can see here a black family is kind of cowering at this new reality, kind of understanding that it does not mean anything positive for them or their children, which they cradle in their arms. Okay, so a big question related to Reconstruction is, well, did it succeed or fail? And that's something I want you to think about quite a bit as we sum up this unit. What would a success have looked like to radical Reconstructionists? And was there real reform in the South in terms of reorganizing or truly long-term reshaping race relations in the South? Okay, so you think about that, and I will see you in class.